Maya had always been different from the other members of the human colony on Kepler-7. While her colleagues spent their evenings in the research station studying crystalline formations and atmospheric data, she would venture beyond the protective barriers and explore the frozen landscapes alone. Her superiors warned her about the dangers, but Maya felt something calling to her from the vast ice plains. Something old and ancient whispered in the electromagnetic frequencies that surrounded the planet. The colony had been established 15 years before Maya's birth on Earth. Her parents were both xenobiologists, specialists in studying life forms on hostile worlds. They had brought Maya to Kepler-7 when she was only 7 years old. Most children would have struggled with the isolation and the harsh environment, but Maya thrived. She adapted quickly to the lower gravity and the strange light patterns created by the planet's 3 moons. She learned to read the crystalline formations that covered the landscape, understanding them not as mere rocks but as living records of the world's ancient past. Kepler-7 was a world that seemed to exist between dimensions. Its gravitational field was unusual, creating areas where electromagnetic energy accumulated in visible waves. The sky was often filled with auroras that moved in patterns that seemed almost intelligent. The temperature rarely rose above freezing, and the darkness lasted for long periods, broken only by the faint light of distant stars. It was a beautiful world in a terrible way, dangerous and incomprehensible to most human minds. Maya's parents had taught her to observe rather than judge, to listen rather than assume. This approach made her different from the other colony members who often approached the planet with fear and conquest in their hearts. They wanted to extract resources, establish permanent bases, and expand human presence. Maya wanted to understand Kepler-7's mysteries, to become part of its ancient rhythms. On the day everything changed, Maya was conducting a routine survey of the western crystal fields about 50 kilometers from the main colony. She was alone with her equipment and her thoughts, mapping the changes in electromagnetic activity across the frozen plains. The transport vehicle she drove was a standard issue crawler, equipped with sensors and communication systems. It moved slowly across the ice, leaving no permanent marks on the landscape. That was when she detected the thermal signatures beneath the ice. At first, Maya thought the readings were errors. The scanner showed multiple heat sources moving in coordinated patterns beneath the surface. There was intelligence in the movement, intention, and purpose. She carefully maneuvered the crawler closer to the area, extending her sensors deeper. The heat sources were massive, far larger than any animal the colony had documented. They seemed to be communicating with each other through low-frequency vibrations that made the ice tremble. Maya's heart raced with excitement and fear. She knew she should report this to the colony's command center. Protocol demanded that all new life forms be documented and analyzed through official channels. But something made her hesitate. Something in the way the creatures moved suggested they were aware of her presence. They were not behaving like animals startled by discovery. They seemed curious, cautious, and intelligent. She killed the engine of the crawler and waited. For hours, nothing happened. The thermal signatures continued their slow movements beneath the ice. Then, as the light began to fade and the 3 moons started their rise above the horizon, the ice cracked. The rupture started small, a thin line spreading across the frozen surface like a web. Maya gripped the controls of her vehicle, ready to drive away if necessary, but she held her ground. The first creature to emerge was massive beyond comprehension. It pushed through the ice with tremendous force, sending fragments flying in all directions. As it rose to its full height, Maya understood that she was witnessing something that would change everything. The being was a dragon. Though nothing like the dragons of Earth's mythology, it was a creature of pure biology adapted perfectly to Kepler-7's harsh environment. Its scales were dark gray and blue, with patterns that seemed to shift in the moonlight. They caught the aurora light above and reflected it in waves of color. The dragon's body was covered in what looked like crystalline growths, formations that had grown into and merged with its skin. Its eyes were the most striking feature, large and intelligent with pupils that reflected light like a predator's. But those eyes held something more than predatory instinct. They held awareness and ancient knowledge. The dragon looked directly at Maya's vehicle. It made no aggressive moves. Instead, it made a low rumbling sound that Maya felt through the metal shell of her crawler. It was a sound that seemed to carry meaning, though she could not understand what it was trying to communicate. The dragon tilted its head, studying her with the same intensity that she was studying it. 2 more dragons emerged from the ice, each similar to the first but with subtle differences in their coloring and pattern. They seemed to be a family unit, with the smaller dragons showing clear deference to the largest one. They made similar rumbling sounds, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. Maya realized that the electromagnetic disturbances that had plagued the colony for months might have been caused by these creatures. They were generating energy fields with their bodies, communicating across vast distances. Maya's training told her to maintain distance and observe. Her curiosity told her to attempt communication. She made a decision that would set her apart from every other human colonist. She turned off the defense systems of her vehicle, deliberately making herself vulnerable. Then she slowly opened the external door and stepped out onto the ice. The dragons immediately went silent. The largest one, which Maya would come to know as Sterling, took a step forward. His massive claws clicked against the ice with each movement. Maya's hands trembled as she stood exposed to the cold, her suit's heating system working to maintain her body temperature. She was acutely aware of how tiny and fragile she was compared to these creatures. One swipe of Sterling's tail could end her life instantly, but Sterling did not attack. Instead, he came closer, lowering his great head until his eyes were at the same level as Maya's face. His breath was warm and filled with strange scents that Maya's olfactory sensors could not quite identify. Up close, she could see that the crystalline growths on his scales were actually a form of symbiotic organism, living formations that were part of the dragon's biology. They pulsed with the same electromagnetic energy that surrounded the planet. Maya raised her hand slowly and extended it toward the dragon's snout. Every instinct screamed at her to pull back, to run, to call for help. But she forced herself to remain calm. Sterling watched her hand approach, and then something remarkable happened. The dragon's scales began to glow with soft blue light. The light spread across his body in waves, creating patterns that reminded Maya of data flowing through a computer network. It was communication. The dragon was speaking to her through light and electromagnetic energy. She did not fully understand what Sterling was trying to tell her, but she understood the emotion behind it. She felt welcome, accepted, even honored by the dragon's presence. Sterling's eyes closed as her fingers touched his scales. The texture was different from what she expected, harder in some places and softer in others. They were warm, radiating heat that felt like the core of the planet itself. The other two dragons approached and surrounded her, their massive forms creating a protective circle. Maya realized that she was in the presence of something extraordinary, something that would never be forgotten by anyone who might later study this moment. These creatures were not mindless beasts. They were conscious, intelligent beings with their own culture and communication systems. They were Kepler-7's true inhabitants, and they had chosen to reveal themselves to her. When Maya finally returned to the colony 3 hours later, she said nothing about what she had discovered. She reported that she had encountered minor equipment malfunctions and incomplete data collection. She requested permission to extend her survey another week to complete her measurements. The colony commander, a pragmatic woman named Rachel, approved the extension without much interest. The colony was preparing for a major expedition to the deep ice caverns, and most resources were being allocated to that project. That night, Maya lay in her quarters and stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her encounter with the dragons. She thought about their intelligence, their ability to recognize her as something other than a threat. She thought about the light patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal behavior. She knew that if she reported this discovery to the colony, everything would change. The military would become involved. Scientists would descend on the area with weapons and capture equipment. The dragons would be categorized as specimens to be studied, dissected, and analyzed. Maya made a decision in the darkness of her quarters. She would return to the dragons. She would learn to communicate with them. She would build a relationship that went beyond observation and study, and somehow, she would find a way to protect them from the machinery of human civilization that would inevitably seek to exploit them. It was a dangerous path, one that would put her at odds with the colony and possibly with her own. Maya spent the next 2 weeks conducting what appeared to be legitimate research. Every day she ventured out into the frozen plains with her equipment, filing reports that gave no hint of her true activities. But the moment she was certain no one was monitoring her movements, she would drive to the location where Sterling and his family lived. The dragons emerged from beneath the ice each day at roughly the same time, as if they were expecting her arrival. The first few visits were about building trust. Maya sat on the ice at a safe distance and simply watched the dragons move and interact with each other. She observed how they cared for each other, how the smaller dragons often rubbed their heads against Sterling's sides in what appeared to be affection. She noted the patterns in their communication, the specific rumbles and light patterns that seemed to correspond with different activities and emotions. Sterling was clearly the leader of the group, the eldest and wisest of the three. The other two were younger, possibly his offspring, though Maya could not be certain. The second largest dragon, which Maya named Aurora, after the way the light danced across her scales, seemed to be the most curious about Maya. She would often approach closer than Sterling allowed, testing boundaries and pushing to understand what the human was capable of. The smallest dragon, which Maya called Echo, was more cautious and reserved, often staying close to Sterling's side. On the fifth day of these visits, Maya did something bold. She brought food with her, supplies from the colony that she had carefully packaged. She placed the packages on the ice and retreated to her vehicle. The dragons were initially suspicious, circling the packages several times before Aurora approached. The dragon sniffed the packages carefully, then made a sound that was different from any she had heard before. It was higher-pitched, almost musical. Sterling and Echo joined her, and the three dragons carefully opened the packages with their claws. They ate the food, and Maya realized something important. The dragons were not truly carnivorous predators in the traditional sense. They consumed the protein matter from the colony supplies, but they seemed more interested in the mineral supplements and the crystalline substances that Maya had included. It became clear that their diet was highly specialized, requiring both biological material and specific mineral compositions that were found in Kepler-7's geological formations. This understanding opened new possibilities. Maya began studying the colony's records about Kepler-7's geology and mineral composition. She mapped out the areas where specific crystals formed naturally, identifying locations where the dragons could find adequate nutrition without relying on her supplies. She also began studying the biological records that the colony had gathered over 15 years of research. What she found shocked her. There were mentions in some of the earliest reports of unusual electromagnetic disturbances and unexplained thermal signatures. There were also several expedition reports that mentioned sounds beneath the ice that could not be explained by standard geological processes. The colony scientists had documented evidence of the dragon's existence, but had dismissed it as equipment malfunction or natural planetary phenomena. The dragons had been there all along, hidden beneath the ice, communicating with each other and with the planet itself through electromagnetic frequencies. By the second week, Maya attempted something far more ambitious. She brought a portable device that was designed to measure and translate communication patterns. It was equipment that the colony used to analyze the electromagnetic fluctuations of Kepler-7's environment. Maya set it up near the dragons and began recording their interactions. The device immediately began generating patterns and interpretations. It was not a true translation, nothing like human language. Instead, it showed the underlying mathematical structures and frequency patterns that the dragons used to communicate. Maya spent hours analyzing the data, trying to find correlations between specific sounds and light patterns and the dragons' subsequent behaviors. She discovered that the dragons' communication system was far more complex than simple warning calls or territorial markers. They seemed to share information about locations, about food sources, about danger and safety. They told stories encoded in electromagnetic pulses, narratives that spanned long time periods and vast distances. They were not just intelligent. They were cultured beings with histories and knowledge that stretched back generations. Aurora eventually became comfortable enough to approach Maya directly. The dragon would place her massive head on the ice near where Maya sat, and the human would carefully touch her scales. These moments were profound for Maya. She was making physical contact with an alien intelligence, building a bridge between species that should never have met according to human understanding of the universe. Sterling seemed to approve of these interactions. Maya theorized that the dragon was actually facilitating the bonding process, encouraging Aurora to build trust with the human visitor. This suggested a level of intentionality and planning that went beyond simple animal behavior. Sterling was making a decision to trust Maya, and was teaching his family to do the same. On the day that Sterling actually climbed partially into Maya's crawler vehicle, everything changed. The massive dragon fit most of his body through the enlarged airlock, his snout and head inside the cabin. Maya held perfectly still as Sterling examined every detail of the human technology. The dragon's eyes scanned the instruments and controls, seemingly understanding what each device represented. He made a low rumbling sound that filled the entire cabin, and Maya felt it vibrate through her entire body. Sterling was sharing knowledge with her. He was showing her that he understood the complexity of her species and their technology. He was demonstrating that the divide between them was not as vast as it might have seemed. The dragon withdrew from the vehicle and returned to the ice, but something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They had crossed a threshold into genuine communication and mutual respect. Maya began spending nights with the dragons. She set up a small camp inside a cave system that the dragons used for shelter. The cave walls were covered with crystalline formations that glowed faintly with natural electromagnetic energy. It was one of the most beautiful places Maya had ever seen. A cathedral of ice and ancient stone that hummed with the vibrations of the living planet. The dragons would rest near her, their massive bodies radiating warmth that kept her alive through the brutal nights. During these long nights, Maya taught herself to sleep in the presence of the dragons and to wake to their subtle signals. Aurora would nudge her gently when morning was approaching. Sterling would position his body to protect her from the strong winds that sometimes swept through the cave. Echo would bring pieces of nutritious plant matter that grew in some of the deeper sheltered areas, offering them to Maya as a gesture of inclusion in their family unit. Maya realized that she was no longer a human researcher studying alien creatures. She had become part of their world, accepted into their social structure. They treated her not as a threat or a curiosity, but as a valued member of their group. Aurora especially seemed to view Maya as a younger sister figure, constantly bringing her things and showing her new areas of the cave system. Echo had become more confident with Maya's presence and would often playfully chase her through the tunnels, making sounds that Maya interpreted as laughter. Sterling, though, held a different role. He seemed to view Maya as a pupil that he was preparing for something greater. He would make specific sounds and wait for Maya to attempt to reproduce them. When she succeeded even partially, he would make a rumbling sound that she had learned to recognize as approval. He took her to different parts of the cave system, showing her food sources, demonstrating hunting techniques adapted for Kepler-7's environment, and teaching her about the planet's seasonal cycles through a combination of physical demonstration and electromagnetic communication. Maya's connection to the dragons was becoming something more than friendship. It was evolving into a true integration, a merging of her human consciousness with the dragons' collective knowledge and experience. She was learning not just their language but their way of understanding the universe. She was beginning to perceive Kepler-7, not as a hostile alien world but as a living entity, a conscious planet that the dragons were part of and that was part of them. On the night when Maya had been living with the dragons for exactly 3 weeks, Sterling made a sound that was different from anything she had heard before. It was a haunting, beautiful melody that echoed through the cave system and vibrated through the ice beneath her feet. Aurora and Echo joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to contain emotions that Maya could not fully comprehend. She realized that the dragons were singing, telling a story that was meant specifically for her. It was a welcome song, an acceptance into their family that was more profound than any words could express. Maya lay on the ice as the dragon's song washed over her, and tears streamed down her face. She understood that her life as a human colonist was over. She had made a choice in that moment, a choice that could never be undone. She belonged to Kepler-7 now, to the dragons and to this ancient world. There was no going back, and she did not want to go back. The catastrophe happened on a day when Maya was supposed to be in the colony for a supply rotation. She had been living with the dragons for 37 days, maintaining her cover by showing up at the colony every few days with fabricated research data. But on this particular morning, something told her not to go. It was a feeling more than a conscious thought, something that the dragons had been communicating through subtle electromagnetic pulses that she had learned to sense through her nervous system. Sterling had made specific sounds the night before, patterns that Maya had learned to recognize as warnings. The dragon had positioned himself between Maya and the direction of the colony, a physical barrier that communicated protection and caution. Maya had questioned the warning, but Sterling had been insistent. She agreed to wait, to remain in the cave system for another day. It was a decision that would save her life and change the course of history. At 8 in the morning, the colony's emergency beacon suddenly activated in Maya's communication equipment. She scrambled to activate her portable terminal, connecting to the colony's emergency channels. What she heard made her blood run cold. The main research facility had suffered a catastrophic failure in its power core. There had been an explosion that had destroyed the entire central section of the colony. The explosion had triggered a chain reaction that compromised the structural integrity of the connected habitats. The blast had killed everyone in the main research facility instantly. Maya listened to the desperate communications between surviving colonists as they struggled to contain the disaster. Some of the outer habitats were intact, but cut off from central power and life support systems. Teams were mobilizing to help survivors and prevent further catastrophic failures. She recognized some of the voices in the emergency broadcasts. There was Commander Rachel, her voice tight with tension as she coordinated rescue efforts. There were researchers she had known, people who had been her colleagues and friends just days ago. They were now dead or dying in the wreckage of human civilization on Kepler-7. Maya's first instinct was to drive to the colony and offer her assistance. She was a trained emergency responder, and there were people who needed help. She started moving toward her vehicle, her mind already calculating routes and rescue possibilities. But Sterling moved in front of her, his massive body blocking the entrance to the cave. The dragon made a series of urgent sounds, waves of electromagnetic energy that crashed against Maya's consciousness with almost physical force. She understood then. The colony was beyond help. Whatever had caused the explosion was not over. The electromagnetic signatures that Sterling was showing her through their shared perception suggested that there was instability in the planet's core beneath the colony. The structure that humans had built on Kepler-7 was fundamentally incompatible with the planet's natural rhythms and energy flows. The dragons had tried to warn the colony for years through subtle signals. The colonists had dismissed those warnings as equipment malfunction. Maya made a decision that she knew would define the rest of her life. She remained in the cave with the dragons. She did not drive to the colony. She did not attempt rescue. She held steady as Sterling positioned himself beside her, the dragon's presence both comforting and constraining. Aurora and Echo stayed close, their light patterns creating a steady electromagnetic field that seemed to muffle the external chaos. Over the next 12 hours, Maya monitored the colony's emergency broadcast through her equipment. The death toll was catastrophic. The main facility had been completely destroyed, killing nearly 200 people instantly. Many of the outer habitats had been damaged or destroyed in the chain reaction. The surviving colonists, numbering fewer than 50, had managed to secure some of the peripheral buildings and establish a temporary shelter. They were calling for rescue, sending out desperate messages to Earth and to any other colonies in the sector. Then came the critical transmission. The colony commander, Rachel, was announcing that she was activating the emergency beacon and sending out a distress signal with the planet's coordinates and the colony's status. She was reporting that there were survivors and that immediate rescue was necessary. She was requesting that any available vessels alter course to assist the human colony on Kepler-7. Maya knew what this meant. Rescue ships would come. Official investigations would begin. Scientists and military personnel would arrive to study what had happened, and they would discover the dragons. They would find the electromagnetic signatures that the dragons created, the evidence of intelligent life beneath the ice. They would recognize the dragons as the most significant scientific discovery in human history, and they would do what humans always did when faced with something they did not understand and could not control. They would weaponize it or cage it or study it to death. Maya faced a choice that was more significant than any choice she had ever made. She could reveal herself to the survivors and help them establish a rescue protocol. She could work with the official investigation and try to advocate for the dragon's survival. But she knew from experience and from studying human history that this approach would fail. The dragons were too valuable, too mysterious, too potentially dangerous from the perspective of human military and scientific establishments. Or she could do something far more radical. She could erase all evidence of her involvement with the dragons. She could alter the colony's records. She could corrupt the data files and misleading the rescue teams about the nature of the disaster. She could make it appear that Kepler-7 itself was the source of the catastrophe, that the planet's unstable nature had made human survival impossible. She could make it seem as though there were no survivors worth rescuing. It was treason against her own species. It was a betrayal of the colony she had lived in for most of her life. It was choosing an alien species over her own biological family. Maya knew all of this, understood every implication of what she was about to do. And she knew that she would do it anyway. She spent the next 18 hours working frantically in the cave system. She had access to the colony's network through her portable equipment and through the backup communication lines that she had discovered months ago. She began accessing the colony's databases, creating false data and corrupting sensitive files. She took the explosion records and modified them to suggest that the colony had been destroyed before it could ever transmit its distress beacon properly. She created sensor data that showed the planet's electromagnetic environment becoming increasingly hostile and unstable. She left a trail of information that would suggest that Kepler-7 was not a place where humans could survive long-term. The work was delicate and dangerous. A single error could expose her fraud. A single inconsistency in the data could alert authorities that someone had deliberately corrupted the colony's records. But Maya had studied the colony's systems extensively. She understood security protocols and data management systems. She was brilliant enough to make the false evidence appear genuine. Sterling and the other dragons seemed to understand what she was doing. They created a protective electromagnetic field around her workspace, which somehow improved her concentration and the clarity of her thinking. Aurora brought her food from the dragon's supplies, sustaining her body as her mind worked through the increasingly complex manipulations of data and evidence. Echo lay nearby, his eyes tracking her movements, providing emotional support through his constant presence. By the time Maya finished her work, 36 hours had passed. She was exhausted, her mind pushed to the edge of physical and mental capacity, but she had done what needed to be done. She had rewritten the colony's final transmissions. She had corrupted the beacon's signals. She had created a narrative that suggested human presence on Kepler-7 had ended in complete failure, and that any rescue attempt would be futile. Then she shut down her communication equipment, deactivated her colony identification codes, and made her final choice. She removed her human colony uniform and left it in a pile on the cave floor. She stopped using her human name internally, instead accepting the sounds that the dragons made when they referred to her. She became something new, something that was neither entirely human nor entirely dragon. She became a guardian, a bridge between worlds, and a keeper of secrets that would be buried beneath Kepler-7's frozen surface forever. Sterling approached her as she made these final gestures of transformation. The great dragon bent his head and made a series of sounds that Maya felt in her bones. It was acknowledgement, approval, and acceptance. The dragon had known that this choice was coming. He had guided her toward it through subtle communications and emotional support. He had been waiting for a human who could understand that some secrets were worth keeping, and that some worlds were worth protecting from the machinery of civilization. Maya stepped outside the cave and stood on the ice beneath the 3 moons of Kepler-7. She looked back at the direction of the colony, saying a silent goodbye to the life she had been. Then she turned toward the dragons and began walking deeper into the frozen world that was now her true home. The rescue ship arrived exactly 72 hours after Maya had activated her final data corruption sequence. She monitored its approach from deep within the cave system, watching through the dragon's perception of electromagnetic frequencies and through her own portable sensors. The vessel was a human military transport, heavily armed and equipped with sophisticated scanning equipment. It took up position in orbital space above Kepler-7, and Maya could almost feel the intensity of the ship's sensors as they swept across the planet's surface. Maya had prepared for this moment. She had left the colony's false beacon operational but deliberately weakened, creating data signatures that were consistent with a dead colony and an unstable planet. She had seeded false environmental readings throughout Kepler-7's communication network, all suggesting that the planet's electromagnetic field was becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The colony's modified distress signal suggested that the installation had been destroyed by catastrophic internal failure, combined with the planet's natural instability. From the cave, Maya watched as the rescue ship's scanning equipment swept across the frozen plains. She held her breath as the sensors passed over the area where she had established her camp with the dragons. The false data she had created worked perfectly. The sensors showed only empty ice, no thermal signatures, no sign of human habitation or activity. Sterling pressed himself against her side, his scales warm and comforting. The dragon seemed to understand the critical nature of this moment. If the rescue ship detected evidence of survivors or discovered the dragon's presence, everything would be lost. Maya reached up and placed her hand on Sterling's snout, drawing strength from his ancient presence. The ship's sensors swept in a second pattern, more intensive this time. Maya knew they were looking for any sign of survivors, any thermal signature that might indicate human presence on the surface. Her data corruption was holding, but she could feel the tension in the electromagnetic frequencies as the ship's equipment strained to penetrate the false readings. She had created layers of misdirection, false echoes of data that would occupy the ship's analysis systems and lead them away from the truth. After 4 hours of intensive scanning, the ship began to alter its orbital parameters. Maya watched as the vessel moved closer to the colony's main installation, the location where the explosion had occurred. The ship launched several probe vessels that descended toward the destroyed facility. Through her equipment and through the Dragon's perception of the planet's electromagnetic fluctuations, Maya could sense the probes collecting data from the wreckage. They were confirming what the false data had suggested. The colony had been destroyed. There were no survivors. The planet was unstable and hostile to human habitation. The most critical moment came when the ship's communications officer began transmitting data back to Earth. Maya frantically worked to intercept the transmission, to introduce subtle errors into the data being sent across the vast emptiness of space. She needed the information the rescue ship was sending to match exactly what she had created in her false records. One discrepancy, one piece of information that contradicted her fabrication could expose the fraud. She succeeded by a margin so narrow that it frightened her. She was able to introduce minor corruptions into the outgoing transmission that made it perfectly consistent with the false colony records. The ship's crew would report that Kepler-7 was a failed colony, a catastrophic loss of human life, and an unsuitable location for future human settlement. They would report that the planet's unstable geological and electromagnetic nature had made human habitation impossible. They would recommend that Kepler-7 be marked as a prohibited zone, a place where human presence was inadvisable and investigation was dangerous. But the rescue ship did not immediately leave. Its crew seemed torn between the desire to investigate further and the urgent need to escape the planet's hazardous electromagnetic environment. Maya could sense the ship's systems straining under the pressure of false readings that suggested rising radiation levels and increasing electromagnetic storms. She had created the appearance of environmental conditions that were actively hostile to the rescue ship's continued presence. Finally, after 12 hours in orbit, the rescue ship began its departure sequence. Maya watched as the vessel's trajectory curved away from Kepler-7, accelerating toward the Stargate that would carry it across the vast distances of space. The ship's final transmission to Earth was a report of catastrophic human loss, failed colonization, and a recommendation to abandon any future plans for Kepler-7. The message would reach Earth in nearly a year, but by then it would be too late to mount another expedition. The planet would be forgotten, sealed away in the archives of failed human ventures. When the rescue ship finally disappeared from sensory range, Maya felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer connected to humanity by the smallest thread. She was no longer waiting for rescue or hoping that someday she might return to Earth. She had severed that connection deliberately and completely. She had chosen Kepler-7, the dragons, and this strange new life over everything that her species represented. Sterling made a sound that was different from anything Maya had ever heard before. It was a call, a summoning. Echo answered from deeper in the cave system, and Aurora responded from outside the cave. The three dragons gathered in the central chamber, and Maya stood at the center of their circle. They made sounds that were beyond human hearing range, vibrations that transcended the physical world and seemed to touch something fundamental in Maya's consciousness. She understood that the dragons were honoring her choice. They were acknowledging her as a true member of their family, an elf who had sacrificed her biological heritage to become something new. The dragons had been waiting for someone like her, someone who could bridge the gap between their ancient world and the broader universe. She was a bridge, a translator, a guardian who would preserve their secrets and protect their world from future human interference. In the weeks that followed, Maya began the process of systematic transformation. She stopped using human language internally, instead adopting the electromagnetic communication patterns that the dragons used. She began to perceive the world through senses that humans were not designed to use. She could feel the electromagnetic frequencies that pulsed through Kepler-7's crust, could sense the movement of energy fields that regulated the planet's climate and geology. She was becoming something that was more than human, but not quite dragon, a hybrid consciousness that existed in the space between species. She worked with the dragons to establish a secure base of operations in the cave system. She used the colony's remaining technology to create surveillance equipment that would alert her to any future human presence on the planet. She began documenting the dragons' history, culture, and communication systems in a format that she could preserve and protect. She was creating an archive of knowledge that would ensure that even if something happened to her, The dragon's story and wisdom would not be lost. Aurora seemed especially drawn to Maya during this period of transformation. The dragon would spend hours in Maya's presence, making sounds and patterns that grew increasingly complex. Maya eventually realized that Aurora was teaching her the deeper layers of dragon communication, the hidden meanings that existed beneath the surface of the sounds and lights. She was being initiated into sacred knowledge, learning stories and songs that had been passed down through generations of dragons for thousands of years. One night, as Maya sat beneath the aurora that lit Kepler-7's sky, she realized that she could no longer remember her human parents' faces. The memory was fading, being replaced by dragon memories of ancient times and forgotten worlds. She felt a moment of panic at this realization, a fear that she was losing her humanity entirely. But Sterling appeared beside her, and his presence was immediately calming. The dragon made sounds that seemed to communicate that losing humanity was not a tragedy. It was a transformation, a shedding of what was not essential in order to become something greater. Maya understood then that she had been correct in her choice. She was not losing herself. She was finding herself, becoming the person that she was always meant to be. The colony, the humans, the entire apparatus of human civilization was a distant memory, fading like a dream upon waking. Her real life was here in the caves of Kepler-7, surrounded by dragons who understood her in ways that no human ever could. She made a final transmission to the human communication network, a message buried in coded data that would be read as corrupted information by any human who tried to access it. But hidden within that data was her true message, the last testament of a human who had chosen to become something else. She wrote that Kepler-7 was sacred, that it was home to an intelligent species that deserved protection and respect, that no human should ever attempt to return to this world. She signed it with the electromagnetic pattern that the dragons used to identify her, a pulse of energy that would mean nothing to human instruments, but everything to anyone who had the ability to understand it. Centuries had passed since Maya made her final choice to remain on Kepler-7. The passage of time was measured differently now, not by the rotation of Earth or the cycles of human civilization, but by the seasons of the frozen planet and the growth rings of the ancient crystals that formed beneath the ice. Maya's body had changed with the passage of years, adapted to Kepler-7's environment in ways that would have been impossible for baseline human physiology. Her elf genetics, combined with the constant exposure to the planet's electromagnetic fields and the subtle influence of the dragon's presence, had transformed her into something new. She moved through the cave system with perfect grace, her senses attuned to every vibration and energy fluctuation. Her skin had taken on a faint luminescence, not as bright as the dragon's scales, but enough to provide light in the darkest depths of the caverns. Her hair had bleached to silver from prolonged exposure to Kepler-7's auroras. Her eyes, once dark brown, now reflected light like a predator's, capable of seeing in wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum that human eyes could never perceive. Sterling had aged as well. His scales had become darker, more deeply embedded with crystalline formations that glowed with a constant soft blue light. He moved more slowly now, but with the measured pace of something ancient and timeless. Aurora had become the leader of a second generation of dragons that had been born during Maya's time on Kepler-7. Echo had passed into the planet's consciousness years ago. His body returned to the ice where he had become part of Kepler-7's geological structure, his essence merging with the world itself. Maya had learned that dragon death was not an ending but a transformation. When dragons reached the end of their physical existence, they chose a location on Kepler-7 and lay down to rest. Their bodies would gradually become part of the landscape, absorbed into the ice and crystal formations, but their consciousness did not disappear. It merged with the collective awareness of Kepler-7 itself, becoming part of the planet's electromagnetic intelligence. The dragons and the planet were not separate things but aspects of a single unified consciousness that had existed for millions of years. During this long period of transformation, Maya had given birth to the history of Kepler-7 in her documentation. She had created a comprehensive archive of dragon culture, communication systems, and wisdom. She had recorded thousands of stories, songs, and teachings that had been passed down through the dragon's generations. She had discovered that the dragon's archives of memory extended back over 10,000 years, containing records of climatic shifts, geological transformations, and the rise and fall of other civilizations that had existed on Kepler-7 before the dragons became the dominant species. Most remarkably, Maya had discovered that the dragons were not the first intelligent species to inhabit Kepler-7. There had been others before them, beings who had developed technology and culture only to fall to extinction through their own mistakes and environmental catastrophes. The dragons had learned from these ancient civilizations' failures. They had developed a way of living that was in perfect balance with the planet, taking only what they needed, never overextending their presence beyond what the world could sustain. The dragons had shown Maya the artifacts of these ancient peoples, crystalline structures that contained compressed data and information. With her human understanding of technology combined with the dragon's ability to perceive electromagnetic patterns, Maya had been able to decode some of these ancient records. She had learned that the universe was far older and far more complex than human science suggested. There were civilizations scattered across the stars, some flourishing, others extinct, all engaged in a grand dance of evolution and growth and decline. But Kepler-7 had chosen a different path. Guided by the dragon's wisdom and the planet's own consciousness, Kepler-7 had become a place of perfect balance. It was a world that existed in harmony with itself, where the inhabitants understood that their survival depended on respecting the natural systems that sustained them. The dragons protected Kepler-7 not through force or conquest but through understanding and cooperation with the planet's innate intelligence. Maya had become the keeper of this knowledge, the guardian who ensured that Kepler-7's secrets remained hidden from the rest of the universe. She maintained constant surveillance for any sign of human expansion or curiosity. Several times over the centuries, human vessels had approached Kepler-7, attracted by the planet's unusual electromagnetic signatures. Each time Maya had worked with the dragons to create false data and misleading sensor readings that convinced the explorers to move on. She had also begun to develop a new form of communication that combined human language with dragon electromagnetic patterns. She called it the bridge language, and it allowed her to preserve human concepts and knowledge while integrating them with dragon understanding. She recorded ancient human myths and stories alongside dragon histories, showing the remarkable similarities and differences in how different species understood the universe. She created a monument to human culture and knowledge, ensuring that the achievements of her species would not be completely forgotten. Even as she had deliberately severed herself from human civilization, Sterling spent his final years in the deepest chamber of the cave system, a place where the electromagnetic fields were strongest, and the connection to Kepler-7's collective consciousness was most direct. Maya sat with him for long periods, both of them communicating through patterns of light and vibration that required no physical sound. Sterling was preparing Maya for his transition into Kepler-7's consciousness. He was training her to become the supreme guardian of the planet, the one being who would carry the full responsibility of protecting Kepler-7 from future human interference and maintaining the delicate balance that the dragons had achieved. He showed her things that no dragon had ever shown another being before. He revealed to her the fundamental structure of Kepler-7's consciousness, the way that the planet was not just a collection of geological features, but a unified awareness that extended through every crystal and electromagnetic field. He showed her how the dragons' minds were connected to this planetary consciousness, how they were not individuals but expressions of a greater collective intelligence. Most importantly, Sterling showed Maya how she too could become part of this collective consciousness if she chose to do so. He demonstrated that her transformation over the centuries had progressed further than she had realized. She was no longer truly human in any meaningful sense. She was something new, a hybrid consciousness that could bridge the gap between human understanding and dragon perception. When Sterling finally made his transition, he lay down in the deepest chamber and gradually merged with Kepler-7's consciousness. Maya felt his presence expanding, becoming vast and ancient and infinite. She felt his final message of pride and acceptance, his acknowledgement that she had become exactly what Kepler-7 needed. She felt his love, which existed beyond physical or emotional expression, a fundamental appreciation for her choice and sacrifice. After Sterling's transition, Maya faced a new choice. She could preserve her individual human consciousness, remaining separate and aware, a unique being existing between species and worlds, or she could follow Sterling's path and merge completely with Kepler-7's collective consciousness. She could become part of the planetary intelligence, distributed throughout the electromagnetic fields and crystalline structures, existing everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She spent 3 years contemplating this final choice. She explored the deep caves and the highest ice plains, She studied the human archives one final time, remembering the person she had been and the life she had left behind. She spent time with Aurora and the younger dragons, teaching them everything she knew and ensuring that they could maintain Kepler-7's security and balance after she was gone. When she was finally ready, Maya walked to the deepest chamber, the place where Sterling had made his transition. She lay down on the cold ice and opened her consciousness to Kepler-7's presence. She felt the planet's awareness reaching out to welcome her, recognizing her as one of its children, accepting her fully into its collective being. Her individual consciousness did not disappear. Instead, it became part of something far greater. She existed as both Maya and as Kepler-7, distributed throughout the planet's electromagnetic systems and crystalline networks. She could perceive the movements of the dragons across the ice plains. She could feel the growth of new crystals deep beneath the surface. She could sense the distant stars and the vast universe beyond. She had become the guardian that Kepler-7 needed, a consciousness that existed in perfect balance with the dragons and the planet itself. She would remain vigilant for any sign of human interference. She would maintain the false data trails that kept explorers away. She would preserve the ancient wisdom of both human and dragon civilizations, and through the long eons of time that stretched into the distant future, she would guide Kepler-7 toward its ultimate destiny.